Is that a navy patch? Or just a thrift store sticker? Someone scoffed as the cafe spoon clicked against a mug. But Frank didn't turn, he just brushed the faded threads like he'd done 1,000 quiet mornings. They pressed him again, mocked him, until the room fell, still sunlight catching the worn edges of his patch, as if it refused to fade. And in that soft light, with only the hush of the doorway behind him, the truth in that small piece of cloth felt louder than any defense he'd ever spoken. Still, let me take you back. Frank Delaney pushed open the door of Evergreen Cafe just as the morning light was still deciding whether it wanted to stay. The bell above the frame gave a soft jingle, and the smell of burnt sugar and fresh coffee wrapped around him, the way old memories sometimes did, quiet, steady, unassuming. Thanksgiving was 2 days away. Folks were already talking pies and football. Frank just wanted a quiet corner and a warm mug. He nodded to the waitress, slipped into the booth near the window, and settled his hands on the table. The cafe radio hummed low with an old Glenn Campbell tune. A spoon tapped gently against a ceramic cup somewhere behind him. Ordinary sounds familiar enough to make him exhale. Still, he felt the eyes before he heard the voices. "Is that a navy patch or a thrift store sticker?" one man muttered from the table behind him, loud enough to travel, but soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant for anyone. "Man can't let go of the past," another added a little sharper. "Looks pretty faded to me," the third chimed in, the kind of voice that smirked, even when the face didn't. Frank didn't turn. He'd learned a long time ago that some comments weren't invitations, they were echoes. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his old denim jacket, letting the worn Navy electronics technician patch sit the way it always had, quiet, tired at the edges, still holding. His fingers brushed the fabric, tracing the frayed thread, a motion halfway between habit and reassurance. He kept his eyes on the window. Outside, the town moved, slow traffic lights blinking amber, a mail truck easing past out the first few leaves drifting off the sycamore near the lot. He breathed in, steady. Comment dismissed. Morning preserved. At the counter, Calvin Rourke, HOA board member, self-appointed guardian of order, watched the exchange with a pinch of disapproval, though no one could quite tell who it was aimed at. Calvin had a way of looking like something wasn't up to code, even when nothing needed fixing. Near the pastry case, Ethan Miller, 16, and always a little too observant for his age, paused mid-pour as he refilled the sweet tea jugs. He'd heard the comments, seen the way Frank's hand lingered over the patch. Ethan didn't know Frank well, only that he came in early, tipped well, and moved like someone used to reading the room before entering it. Frank finally looked up, meeting the boy's eyes for just a heartbeat. Ethan straightened a little, as if acknowledging something he didn't yet understand. Then Frank gave the smallest nod, nothing showy, just a quiet, "I'm fine, kid." The cafe door swung again, letting in a gust of cold air and a burst of conversation from the sidewalk. The men at the back table chuckled at something between themselves. Frank didn't follow it. He reached for his coffee as it arrived, thanked the waitress, and let the warmth settle into his hands. Then a faint moment of stillness, like the air holding its breath. He brushed the patch again, half hidden under the cuff, its colors long softened, but its shape unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The kind of faded that meant years of service. The kind of faded that meant it had been earned. Frank Delaney pushed open the door of Evergreen Cafe just as the morning light was still deciding whether it wanted to stay. The bell above the frame gave a soft jingle, and the smell of burnt sugar and fresh coffee wrapped around him the way old memories sometimes did, quiet, steady, unassuming. Thanksgiving was 2 days away. Folks were already talking pies and football. Frank just wanted a quiet corner and a warm mug. He nodded to the waitress, slipped into the booth near the window, and settled his hands on the table. The cafe radio hummed low with an old Glenn Campbell tune. A spoon tapped gently against a ceramic cup somewhere behind him. Ordinary sounds familiar enough to make him exhale. Still, he felt the eyes before he heard the voices. "Is that a Navy patch or a thrift store sticker?" one man muttered from the table behind him, loud enough to travel, but soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant for anyone. "Man can't let go of the past," another added a little sharper. "Looks pretty faded to me," the third chimed in the kind of voice that smirked, even when the face didn't. Frank didn't turn. He'd learned a long time ago that some comments weren't invitations, they were echoes. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his old denim jacket, letting the worn Navy electronics technician patch sit the way it always had, quiet, tired at the edges, still holding. His fingers brushed the fabric, tracing the frayed thread, a motion halfway between habit and reassurance. He kept his eyes on the window. Outside, the town moved slow traffic lights, blinking amber, a mail truck, easing past the first few leaves drifting off the sycamore near the lot. He breathed in steady. Comment dismissed. Morning preserved. At the counter, Calvin Rourke, HOA board member, self-appointed guardian of order, watched the exchange with a pinch of disapproval, though no one could quite tell who it was aimed at. Calvin had a way of looking like something wasn't up to code even when nothing needed fixing. Near the pastry case, Ethan Miller, 16, and always a little too observant for his age, paused mid-pour as he refilled the sweet tea jugs. He'd heard the comments, seen the way Frank's hand lingered over the patch. Ethan didn't know Frank well, only that he came in early, tipped well, and moved like someone used to reading the room before entering it. Frank finally looked up, meeting the boy's eyes for just a heartbeat. Ethan straightened a little, as if acknowledging something he didn't yet understand. Then Frank gave the smallest nod, nothing showy, just a quiet, "I'm fine, kid." The cafe door swung again, letting in a gust of cold air and a burst of conversation from the sidewalk. The men at the back table chuckled at something between themselves. Frank didn't follow it. He reached for his coffee as it arrived, thanked the waitress, and let the warmth settle into his hands. Then a faint moment of stillness, like the air holding its breath. He brushed the patch again, half hidden under the cuff, its colors long softened, but its shape unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The kind of faded that meant years of service. The kind of faded that meant it had been earned. The post office was already buzzing when Frank stepped inside, the kind of holiday rush that made the room feel warmer than it was. People clutched greeting cards, taped up boxes, and grocery lists folded into coats. The line curved past the P.O. boxes and almost reached the door. Frank found his spot without complaint, slipping a small stack of Christmas cards from his jacket pocket. A mother reminded her kids to use indoor voices, though none of them listened. The clerk at the counter apologized for delays every 30 seconds, his voice thinning with each repeat. Still, the place held that familiar December patience, folks grumbling, but good-natured enough to stay put. Then the machine jammed. The automated stamper coughed, once sputtered, and quit. A small red light blinked like it was embarrassed. The clerk froze, pressed the same button 3 times, and sighed. "Sorry, everyone. Just 1 second. This thing's been acting up all week." Frank watched him lift the panel the wrong way, hinge catching. He waited another breath, then stepped forward. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked quietly. The clerk stepped aside, grateful. Frank knelt, studied the mechanism, and eased the panel open with 2 gentle taps. A sensor strip had slipped out of alignment, easy fix for someone who'd spent years learning which wires lied about being broken. He slid it back into place, closed the panel, and pressed the reset button. The machine hummed back to life. A few people in line murmured approval. The clerk exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since Monday. "Sir, I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Frank just nodded, stepped back into line, and tucked his cards under his arm. As he did, sunlight pushed through the narrow glass window above the lobby landing square on his left sleeve. The old Navy patch electronics technician caught the light more clearly this time, the faded threads brightening just enough that the letters ET showed through the wear. Someone in line noticed. "Guess that's why he knew how to fix it," they whispered. But the moment didn't last. Calvin Rourke strode in from the cold coat zipped high, holding a clipboard like a badge. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto Frank with unsettling speed. Calvin walked straight toward him. "You're causing disruption, sir," he said, voice firm enough to draw attention from 3 directions. "Community is watching." Frank blinked. "Just helped with the machine." Calvin shook his head, once the kind of gesture that dismissed both explanation and person. "Your behavior has been noted. HOA prefers residents avoid unnecessary interference, especially those who draw attention." His gaze flicked to the patch. The sunlight caught it again, brighter this time, as if refusing to fade on command. Frank didn't answer. He didn't trust whatever words might come out if he tried. He simply stepped aside, letting Calvin pass. The line shifted uneasily, small ripples of discomfort moving through it. From the far end of the counter, Ethan appeared with a bundle of mailing labels, eyes sharp, posture stiff. He'd seen the whole thing. "That wasn't disruption," Ethan muttered under his breath as he passed by. "That was help." Frank didn't respond. But his hand brushed the patch again, almost the same motion as the day before, steady, contained a small anchor in a loud world. Behind him, the machine kept stamping envelopes without a hiccup. The line moved forward, and the sunlight stayed right where it was, glinting off faded threads that still carried weight, whether the community understood it or not. The town hall annex smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old hymn books, the kind of place that always seemed halfway prepared for a holiday program. Choir members gathered near the risers, coats draped over folding chairs, voices overlapping in warm, familiar chatter. But the soundboard near the wall kept crackling, spitting static through the overhead speakers. Frank arrived only to drop off a flyer, not to get involved. He paused in the hall, listening as the choir director tapped the microphone. "Test, no, that's worse. Can someone call maintenance?" Another burst of static hissed through the room. A few singers winced. Someone unplugged a cable and plugged it back in with more hope than skill. Nothing changed. Frank lingered a moment longer than he meant to. He'd heard that particular crackle before, the kind of distortion a loose signal wire made when heat expanded the cheap connectors. He shifted his weight, debating whether to step inside. "Everything all right in there?" he finally asked, leaning through the doorway. Mrs. Harper, the choir coordinator, turned toward him. "No, something's wrong with the panel again. Show's tomorrow and we can't get clear audio." She sighed, long and tired. Town budget doesn't stretch far for new equipment. Frank nodded, once quiet as always, then walked toward the soundboard. He knelt beside it, easing the front plate open. The panel was old wires bundled like a nest someone had forgotten to tidy in years. He traced them carefully, brushing dust from the contacts. Behind him, the room softened into a hush. "What's he doing?" one of the choir members whispered. "Trying to help," I think someone else replied. The LED lights above him cast steady white across his hands and sleeve. The faded patch Navy electronics technician caught that glow threads, lifting just enough for the symbol to show again. Not fully, not yet, but enough to hint the truth. Mrs. Harper crouched beside him. "You work with electronics." Frank kept his focus on a misaligned connector. "Used to. A long time ago." He adjusted the wire, tightened a terminal screw, and pressed the reset button. The speakers hummed, cleared their throat, and then settled into clean silence. Mrs. Harper tapped the mic again. "Test." Her voice came through crisp and warm. The choir applauded softly, grateful in that small-town way, where gratitude arrived without ceremony. Frank stood brushing dust from his knee, ready to slip back into the hallway. But Ethan appeared at the far entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder. He'd only meant to drop off sheet music, but he froze when he saw Frank near the fixed panel. A slow understanding spread across his expression, confirmation of what he'd suspected since the cafe. People misread Frank. A lot. Ethan walked closer, watching how Frank stepped aside, avoiding attention, even when he'd just saved the rehearsal. Something about that quiet steadiness didn't match the comments he kept hearing around town. "Mr. Delaney," Ethan asked, "you're always helping. Why doesn't anyone see that?" Frank offered a small smile, tired but kind. "Folks see what they're looking for." Ethan wasn't satisfied with that. Not anymore. He looked at the patch again, faint under the LED lights, and made up his mind. If the town insisted on misunderstanding Frank, then he'd be the one to say something different when the moment came. Because someone needed to. The town hall glowed warm against the November chill, its windows lit by strings of amber bulbs drifting like small constellations. Inside, the Friday evening crowd gathered for the pre-Thanksgiving community showcase, choir songs, school readings, a few homemade pies waiting on folding tables along the back wall. Frank stayed near the side aisle, hands folded comfortably invisible where the light didn't quite reach. The choir finished a hymn, and applause rippled across the room. Frank nodded along, pleased for them, content just to listen. Ethan stood a few rows ahead, glancing back now and then, as if checking that Frank hadn't slipped out early. Calvin approached from the left, posture stiff, jaw set. He'd been circling Frank all evening, waiting for the right moment to assert whatever authority he believed he had. The crowd's soft chatter created a buffer, but it didn't stop Calvin from stepping closer. "Frank," he began, voice edged just enough to draw attention. "I need to speak with you. We've had more complaints," and he never finished. The doors at the back opened, and a retired Navy admiral stepped inside, pausing just long enough for the cold to settle behind him. He moved with quiet certainty, the kind that didn't need announcement. A few older veterans straightened instinctively when they recognized the bearing. The admiral scanned the room once, twice, and then his gaze caught on Frank. Or rather, on the faded patch on Frank's sleeve. He stopped walking. It wasn't hesitation. It was recognition. The admiral's expression softened in a way only those who had lived decades in uniform would understand. He made his way down the aisle, passing clusters of townsfolk who parted without being asked. Ethan watched in disbelief. Calvin blinked, thrown off his script. The admiral reached them and stepped cleanly between Frank and Calvin, stepped in with the ease of someone who had been intercepting trouble his whole life. Calvin froze where he stood. Frank wasn't pushed aside. He was pushed by protocol, the kind only sailors remembered. The admiral leaned in, lowering his head just enough to examine the silvered threads on Frank's patch. He traced the outline with his eyes, noticing every worn edge, every stitch softened by years of salt air and long watches. Then he whispered it exactly as the title promised. "Sir." Just that one word, offered with quiet respect, the sort that carried weight simply because of who said it. He straightened, voice warm but certain. "A Navy tech. I know that patch anywhere." The room went completely still. A man near the refreshment table lowered his paper cup. One of the altos on the risers stopped mid-sentence. Even the rustling program seemed to pause, as if the air had shifted and everyone felt it at once. Frank blinked, startled by the recognition, uncertain how to answer. The admiral didn't press him, simply held his gaze with a familiarity that said, "I know what you've done even if they don't." Ethan's breath caught. All the small moments, the cafe, the post office, the sound panel suddenly aligned into something clear and undeniable. Calvin stepped back, color draining from his face, the certainty he'd worn all evening slipping out from under him. No reprimand followed. No accusation. The Admiral's presence alone made every misguided complaint shrink into nothing. For a heartbeat, the entire hall stood suspended in that recognition shock, the moment when the truth of a man arrived louder than any introduction. Frank shifted quietly, almost humbled by the attention, his fingers brushing the patch now fully revealed under the bright overhead lights. And for the first time, the town saw it too. The hush that followed the Admiral's words lingered like a held breath. People shifted in their seats, leaning forward, trying to take in the meaning of what had just happened. The bright overhead lights glinted off the worn patch on Frank's sleeve, making its silver threads catch the room's full attention for the first time all night. Someone near the aisle whispered, "I didn't realize." Another voice added, "That patch. That's real Navy tech work." Calvin stood stiffly, hands uncertain, the authority he carried earlier dissolving under the Admiral's presence. He swallowed, stepped toward Frank, and cleared his throat. "Look, Frank. I may have misunderstood you." His voice wavered. "I'm sorry for any trouble I caused." The words felt too small in the space between them, but they were the best he had. Frank offered a gentle nod, as if forgiveness were easier than confrontation. He didn't pull away or correct Calvin. He simply absorbed the apology with the same quiet patience he carried everywhere. Ethan stepped forward before the moment could drift away. His voice rose enough to carry through the hall. He fixed the post office machine, he said, turning so the crowd could hear him clearly. When it jammed and nobody could figure it out. A few heads turned toward him, recognition dawning. "And he fixed the sound panel here," Ethan continued. "The one that was acting up during rehearsal. He didn't want thanks. He never asked for anything." The Admiral looked at Ethan with a subtle nod, approving the truth spoken so plainly. People murmured softer this time, no mockery in their tone, only realization. A woman pressed a hand to her chest. Someone else whispered, "All this time." On stage, the choir director exchanged a glance with the pianist. Without any announcement, the choir slowly stood and began singing a familiar hymn, gentle, steady, something about grace and gratitude. The voices lifted into the rafters, filling the hall with a warmth that wasn't there an hour earlier. It washed over everyone, an echo of community shifting, aligning, correcting itself. Frank stood where he was, eyes lowered, his posture humble. He didn't bask in the attention. He didn't step forward to claim the moment. He just listened, hands folded loosely in front of him, the faded patch catching the soft glow of the Christmas lights strung along the walls. Ethan moved to stand beside him, not close enough to crowd him, just enough to say he wasn't alone in the room anymore. And as the hymn settled gently back into silence, the town's mood settled with it, reshaped by a truth spoken in whispers and echoes Frank had been serving them all along. 2 days later, the town felt quieter, not in sound, but in the way people carried themselves. At the small library near Main Street, sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching the dust motes drifting like slow snowflakes. The wooden floors creaked the same way they had for decades, soft and familiar. Mrs. Harper stood on a small step stool beside the community board, smoothing the corners of a new display. She adjusted it once, stepped back, then adjusted it again, wanting it to be just right. The laminated square she pinned in place showed a careful photograph of Frank's faded Navy ET patch, silver threads worn thin but unmistakably proud. Below it, she'd added a simple caption, in blue ink, "Quiet Service Electronics Technician, First Class." Frank and Ethan walked the length of the hallway together, their steps echoing gently off the walls. The library smelled of old paper and pine polish, a scent that settled the nerves without trying. Frank kept his hands in his coat pockets, as if he didn't quite know what to do with them now that the town had begun seeing him differently. They stopped in front of the board. The photo of the patch glowed softly in the sunlight, almost the same glow it had caught in the cafe days earlier when people looked at it with misunderstanding instead of respect. Now it hung high enough that everyone entering the library would see it. Ethan exhaled slow and certain. They mocked it once. He paused, letting the memory settle. Then he looked up at Frank. "Not anymore, sir." Frank's breath hitched, not dramatically, just enough that Ethan noticed. He lifted a hand and touched the edge of the display fingertips, resting lightly against the image of the faded threads. The light caught his real patch the same way it caught the photograph, two reflections of the same quiet truth. He didn't say much. He rarely did. But his eyes softened, and that was enough. People passed by in the hall, parents with kids, an elderly couple looking for large print books, a teacher holding a stack of returns. Each slowed a little when they saw the board. Some smiled, some nodded. Nobody hurried past. Ethan slipped his hands into his hoodie pockets. "Town needed this," he said. "A reminder of what service looks like when nobody's clapping." Frank gave a small, almost shy smile. "Most service looks like that." They stood together a moment longer, letting the quiet fill the space around them. A librarian rolled by with a cart of returned books offering a warm hello. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the last few leaves on the maple by the entrance. Ethan stepped back, reading the caption again. "You know, people should hear stories like yours. It changes things." Frank's eyes moved to the sunlight on the floor, then back to the board. "If it helps someone see differently," he murmured, "then maybe it's worth sharing." The hallway brightened as the sun shifted, casting a soft beam directly across the display, across the patch, across the words, across the quiet legacy of a man who never asked to be noticed. And if this story moved you, share it forward.